First Impressions, continued, Part 1, Chapter 5th. We were inside once more. The doors of the barracks were locked, each with a special padlock, and the prisoners remained shut up until next morning. The roll was checked by a non-commissioned officer, accompanied by 2 soldiers. When an officer happened to be present, the convicts were drawn up in the courtyard, but generally speaking they were identified in the buildings. As the soldiers often made mistakes, they went out and came back in order to count us again and again, until their reckoning was satisfactory. Then the barracks were closed. Each one housed about 30 prisoners, and we were very closely packed on our camp bedsteads. As it was too early to go to sleep, the convicts occupied themselves with work. Besides the old soldier, of whom I have spoken, who slept in our dormitory and represented the prison authority, there was in our barrack another veteran who wore a good conduct badge. It happened not infrequently, however, that the good conduct men themselves committed offenses for which they were sentenced to be whipped. They then lost their rank, and were immediately replaced by comrades whose behavior was considered satisfactory. Our good conduct man was none other than Akim Akimich. To my great astonishment, he was very hard on the prisoners, but they only retaliated with jests. The other old soldier was more prudent and interfered with no one. If he opened his mouth, it was only as a matter of form, as an affair of duty. For the most part he remained silent, seated on his little bedstead, occupied in mending his own boots. That day I could not help remarking to myself, and the accuracy of my observation afterwards became apparent, that all those, whoever they be, who are not convicts but have dealings with convicts, beginning with the soldiers of the escort and the sentinels, look upon their charges in a false and X. The prisoners, perfectly conscious of the fear they inspire, show a certain arrogance. Accordingly, the best prison director is the one who shows no emotion in their presence. In spite of the airs they give themselves, the convicts prefer that confidence should be placed in them. By such means, indeed, they may be conciliated. I have more than once had occasion to notice their astonishment at an official entering their prison without an escort, and certainly their astonishment was not unflattering. A visitor who is intrepid imposes respect. If anything unfortunate happens, it will not be in his presence. The terror inspired by convicts is general, and yet I saw no foundation for it. Is it their appearance, their brigand-like looks, that causes a certain repugnance? Is it not rather the feeling that overwhelms you directly you enter the prison that in spite of all efforts, all precautions, it is impossible to turn a living man into a corpse, to stifle his feelings, his thirst for vengeance and for fife, his passions, and his imperious desire to satisfy them? However that may be, I declare that there is no reason to fear the convicts. A man does not throw himself so quickly nor so easily upon his fellow man, knife in hand. Few accidents happen. They are, indeed, so rare that the danger may be considered non-existent. I speak, it must be understood, only of prisoners already condemned, who are undergoing their punishment, and some of whom are almost happy to find themselves in prison. So attractive under any circumstances is a new form of life. These men live quiet and contented. As for the turbulent ones, the convicts themselves keep them in restraint, and their arrogance never goes too far. A condemned criminal, audacious and reckless as he may be, is afraid of every prison official. It is by no means the same with an accused person whose fate has not been decided. Such a one is quite capable of attacking no matter whom, without any motive of hatred, but solely because he is to be whipped next day. If, indeed, he commits a fresh crime, his offense becomes complicated, punishment is delayed, and he gains time. The act of aggression is explained. It has a cause, an object. The convict wishes at all hazards to change his fate, and that as soon as possible. In connection with this, I myself have witnessed a physiological fact of the strangest kind. In the military section was an old soldier who had been condemned to 2 years' hard labor. He was a great boaster, and at the same time a coward. Generally speaking, the Russian soldier does not boast. He has no time to do so, even had he the inclination. But when such a one does appear among a crowd of others, he is always a coward and a rogue. Dudov, that was the name of the prisoner of whom I am speaking, underwent his punishment, and then returned to his battalion in the line. But like all who are sent to prison to be corrected, he had been thoroughly corrupted. A return horse reappears after 2 or 3 weeks' liberty, not for a comparatively short time, but for 15 or 20 years. So it happened in the case of Dudov. 3 weeks after he had been set at liberty, he robbed one of his comrades, and was, moreover, mutinous. He was taken before a court-martial and sentenced to a severe form of corporal punishment. Horribly frightened, like the coward that he was, at the prospect of punishment, he attacked the officer of the guard with a knife as the latter entered his cell on the day before he was to run the gauntlet of his company. He quite understood that he was aggravating his offense and that the duration of his punishment would be increased, but all he wanted was to postpone for some days, or at least for some hours, a terrible moment. He was such a coward that the officer was not even wounded. He had, indeed, only committed this assault in order to add a new crime to the last already against him, and thus defer the sentence. The moment preceding punishment is terrible for a man condemned to the rods. I have seen many of them on the eve of the fatal day. I generally met with them in the hospital when I was ill, which happened often enough. In Russia, the people who show most compassion for the convicts are certainly the doctors, who never draw those distinctions between the prisoners, which are observed by other persons brought into direct relations with them. In this respect, the common people can alone be compared with the doctors, for they never reproach a criminal with the crime that he has committed, whatever it may be. They forgive him in consideration of the sentence passed upon him. It is well known that the common people throughout Russia call crime a misfortune, and the criminal an unfortunate. This definition is expressive and profound, though unconscious and instinctive. To the doctor, the convicts have naturally recourse, above all when they are to undergo corporal punishment. The prisoner who has been before a court-martial knows, almost to the hour when his sentence will be executed. To escape it, he gets himself sent to the hospital, in order to postpone for some days the terrible moment. When he is declared restored to health, he knows that the day after he leaves the hospital this moment will arrive. Accordingly, on quitting the hospital, the convict is always in a state of agitation. Some of them may endeavor from vanity to conceal their anxiety, but no one is taken in by that. Everyone understands the cruelty of such a moment, and is silent from motives of humanity. I knew one young convict, an ex-soldier sentenced for murder, who was to undergo the maximum punishment. On the eve of the day on which he was to suffer, he had resolved to drink a bottle of vodka into which he had infused a quantity of snuff. A prisoner condemned to the rods always drinks, before the critical moment arrives, a certain amount of spirits which he has procured long beforehand, and often at a fabulous price. He would deprive himself of the necessaries of life for 6 months, rather than not be in a position to swallow half a pint of vodka before the flogging. The convicts are convinced that a drunken man suffers less from the rods or the whip than one who is stone-cold sober. To return to my narrative. A few moments after swallowing his bottle of vodka, the poor devil felt sick. He coughed up blood and was carried unconscious to the hospital. His lungs were so much injured by this accident that phthisis set in and carried him off within a few months. The doctors who had attended him never discovered the origin of his malady. If examples of cowardice are not rare among the prisoners, it must be added that there are some whose intrepidity is quite astounding. I remember many instances of extraordinary courage. The arrival of a terrible bandit in hospital remains fixed in my memory. One fine summer day word went round the infirmary that the notorious prisoner Orlov was to be flogged the same evening, and that he would be brought into hospital afterwards. The patients already there said that the punishment would be a cruel one, and all, including myself, I must admit, awaited with curiosity the arrival of this villain, about whom the most unheard-of tales were told. He was a malefactor of a rare kind, capable of assassinating old men and children in cold blood. He possessed an indomitable force of will and was fully conscious of his power. He had been found guilty of several crimes and condemned to be flogged through the ranks. Towards evening he was brought, or rather carried in. The place was already dark, and candles were lighted. Orloff was excessively pale, almost unconscious, with his thick curly hair of dull, lackluster black. His back was torn and swollen, blue, and stained with blood. The prisoners nursed him throughout the night. They changed his poultices, placed him on his side, prepared the lotion ordered by the doctor. In a word, they showed as much solicitude for him as for a relation or benefactor. Next day he had fully recovered his faculties, and took 1 or 2 turns round the room. I was much astonished, for he was broken down and powerless when he was brought in. He had received only half the number of blows ordered by the sentence when the doctor stopped the punishment, convinced that if it were continued Orloff's death would inevitably ensue. This criminal was of a feeble constitution, weakened by long imprisonment. Anyone who has seen convicts after hogging will remember their thin, drawn features and feverish looks. Orloff soon recovered his powerful energy, which enabled him to overcome his physical weakness. He was no ordinary man. From curiosity, I made his acquaintance, and was able to study him at leisure for an entire week. Never in my life did I meet a man whose will was more firm or inflexible. I had seen at Tobolsk just such another celebrity of the same kind, a brigand chief. This fellow was a veritable wild beast. One had only to be near him, without even knowing him, in order to recognize him as a dangerous man. What scared me above all was his utter lack of intelligence. In his case, matter had won such an ascendancy over mind, that one could see at a glance that he cared for nothing in the world but the brutal satisfaction of his physical desires. And yet I felt certain that Karanev, for such was his name, would have fainted on being condemned to the severe corporal punishment which Orloff had undergone, but that he would have murdered the nearest man to him without blinking. Orloff, on the contrary, was a brilliant example of the triumph of spirit over matter. He had a perfect command over himself. He despised punishment and feared nothing in the world. His dominant characteristic was boundless energy, a thirst for vengeance, and an inflexible will when he had some object to attain. I was not astonished at his haughty air. He looked down upon all around him from the height of his grandeur. Not that he took the trouble to pose, for this pride was an innate quality. I don't believe anything had the least influence over him. He looked upon everything with the calmest eye, as if nothing in the world could surprise him. He knew well that the other prisoners respected him, but he never took advantage of it or gave himself airs. Nevertheless, vanity and conceit are defects from which scarcely any convict is exempt. Orloff was intelligent and strangely frank in talking too much about himself. He replied point-blank to all the questions I put to him, and confessed that he was waiting impatiently for his return to health in order to take the remainder of the punishment he was to undergo. "Now," he said to me with a wink, "it is all over. I shall take the remainder, and then be sent to Nerchinsk with a convoy of prisoners. I shall use the opportunity to escape, and am confident I shall succeed. If only my back would heal a little quicker." For 5 days he was burning with impatience to be in a condition to leave hospital. At times he was gay and in the best of humors, and I profited by those rare occasions to ask him about his adventures. He would contract his eyebrows a little, but always answered my questions straightforwardly. When he realized that I was endeavoring to see through him and discover in him some trace of repentance, he looked at me with a haughty and contemptuous air, as if I were a foolish little boy whom he honored too highly with his conversation. I detected in his countenance a sort of compassion for me. After a moment's pause, he would laugh out loud, but without the least irony, and I fancy he must, more than once, have laughed in the same manner when my words returned to his memory. At last he signed himself out as cured, although his back was not yet completely healed. As I too was almost well again, we left the infirmary together. I returned to barracks, while he was shut up in the guard-room, where he had been formerly detained. On parting, he shook hands with me, which in his eyes was a signal mark of favor. I fancy he did so because at that moment he was in a good humor, but in reality he must have despised me, for I was a feeble being, in all respects contemptible and guilty above all of resignation. Next day, he underwent the second half of his punishment. When the doors of our barrack had been locked at night, there was, in less than no time, a different atmosphere, the air of a private house, almost indeed of home. It was only then that I saw my comrades at their ease. For during the day the under-officers, or some other official, might suddenly arrive, so that the prisoners were always on the alert and never quite relaxed. As soon, however, as the bolts had been shot and the doors padlocked, everyone sat down in his place and began to ply his trade. The room was lighted up in an unexpected manner. Each convict had his candle in its wooden sconce. Some of them stitched boots, others sewed various kinds of garment. The air, already poisonous, became more and more impure. Some of the prisoners, huddled together in a corner, played at cards on a piece of carpet. In each barrack there was a prisoner who possessed a small piece of carpet, a candle, and a pack of horribly greasy cards. The owner of the cards received from the players 15 kopecks, about 6 pence, a night. They generally played at 3 leaves, gorka, that is to say, a game of chance. Each player placed before him a pile of copper money, all that he possessed, and did not get up until he had either lost it or broken the bank. Play continued far into the night, and daybreak sometimes found the gamblers still at their game. Often, in fact, they did not cease until a few minutes before the doors were opened. In our room, as in every room, there were beggars ruined by drink and play, beggars by nature. I purposely say by nature, for in every class of Russians there are, and always will be, strange, easygoing people whose destiny it is always to remain beggars. They are poor devils all their lives, creatures broken down who remain under the domination or guardianship of someone, generally a prodigal or a man who has suddenly made his fortune. All initiative is for them an intolerable burden. They only exist on condition of undertaking nothing for themselves, of serving and living perpetually subject to another's will. They are destined to act by and through others. Under no circumstances, even of the most unexpected kind, can they get rich. They are always beggars. I have met these persons in all classes of society, in all coteries, in all associations, including the literary world. As soon as a card party was made up, one of these beggars, who were quite indispensable to the game, was summoned. He received 5 kopecks for a whole night's employment, and what employment! His duty was to keep guard in the corridor, in 30 degrees Reaumur of frost and in total darkness, for 6 or 7 hours. The man on watch had to listen for the slightest noise, for the governor or one of the officers of the guard would sometimes make a round quite late at night. They used to arrive unexpectedly, and sometimes caught players and the watchers in the act, thanks to the candlelight which could be seen from the courtyard. When the key was heard grating in the padlock, it was too late to put the lights out, and he down on the plank bedsteads. Such surprises were, however, rare. 5 kopecks was a ridiculous payment even in prison, and the gambler's harsh demands astonished me in these as in many other cases. "You are paid, you must do what you are told." This was the argument, and it admitted of no reply. If you paid someone a few kopecks, you had the right to turn him to the best possible account, and even a claim to his gratitude. More than once I saw convicts spend their money extravagantly, throwing it around, and at the same time cheating the man employed to watch. I have witnessed this kind of thing in several barracks on numerous occasions. I have already said that, with the exception of the gamblers, everyone worked. 5 only of the convicts remained completely idle, and went to bed at the first opportunity. My bed was near the door. Next to me was Akim Akimich, and when we were lying down our heads touched. He used to work until 10 or 11 o'clock, pasting together pieces of paper to make multicolored lanterns which had been ordered by someone in the town, and for which he was well paid. He excelled in this kind of work, and did it methodically and regularly. When he had finished, he carefully put away his tools, unfolded his mattress, said his prayers, and slept the sleep of the just. He carried his love of order even to pedantry, and must have secretly believed himself a man of brains, as do most narrow, mediocre persons. I did not like him the first day, although he afforded me plenty of food for thought. I was astonished to find such a man in prison. I shall have occasion to speak of Akimich again. But I must proceed with my description of those with whom I was to live for years. They were to be my companions every moment of that time, and it will be understood that I regarded them with anxious curiosity. On my left slept a group of mountaineers from the Caucasus, nearly all of them exiled for brigandage, but condemned to different punishments. There were 2 Leskians, a Circassian, and 3 Tartars from Dagestan. The Circassian was a morose and somber fellow. He scarcely ever spoke, and looked at you sideways with a sly, sulky, wild beast expression. One of the Leskians, an old man with an aquiline nose, tall and thin, looked a real brigand, but the other, Nura was his name, impressed me most favorably. He was of middle height, still young, built like a Hercules, with fair hair and violet eyes. His nose was slightly turned up, while his features were somewhat of a Finnish cast. Like all horsemen, he walked with his toes in. His body was striped with scars, plowed by bayonet wounds and bullets. Although he belonged to the conquered region of the Caucasus, he had joined the rebels, with whom he used to make continual incursions into our territory. Everyone in prison liked him because of his gaiety and affability. He worked without murmuring, always calm and peaceful. Thieving, cheating, and drunkenness filled him with disgust or threw him into a rage, not that he wished to quarrel with anyone. He simply turned away with indignation. During his confinement, he committed no breach of the rules. Fervently pious, he said his prayers every evening, observed all the Mohammedan fasts like a true fanatic, and passed whole nights in prayer. Everyone liked him and considered him a thoroughly honest man. Nura is a lion, they used to say, and the name lion stuck to him. He was quite convinced that as soon as he had finished his sentence, he would be sent back to the Caucasus. Indeed, this hope alone kept him alive, and I believe he would have died had he been deprived of it. I noticed it the very day of my arrival. One could not but be struck by that calm, honest countenance in the midst of so many somber, sardonic, and repulsive faces. Before I had been half an hour in the prison, he passed by and touched me gently on the shoulder, smiling innocently. I did not at first understand what he meant, for he spoke Russian very badly, but soon afterwards he passed again, and with a friendly smile again touched me on the shoulder. For 3 days running, he repeated this strange proceeding. As I soon found out, he wished to show that he pitied me, and that he felt how painful my first hours of imprisonment must be. He wished to testify his sympathy, to keep up my spirits, and to assure me of his good will. Kind innocent Nura. Of the 3 Dagestan Tartars, all brothers, the elder 2 were well-developed men, while the youngest, Ali, was not more than 22 and looked still younger. He slept by my side, and when I observed his frank, intelligent countenance, thoroughly natural, I was at once attracted to him and thanked my fate that I had him for a neighbor and not some other prisoner. His whole soul could be read in his beaming countenance. His confident smile had a certain childish simplicity. His large black eyes expressed such friendliness, such tender feeling, that I always took pleasure in looking at him. It was a relief to me in moments of sadness and anguish. One day his eldest brother, he had 5, of whom 2 were working in the mines of Siberia, had ordered him to take his yataghan, mount on horseback, and follow him. The respect of the mountaineers for their elders is so great that young Ali dared not ask the object of the expedition. He probably knew nothing about it, nor did his brothers consider it necessary to tell him. They were going to plunder the caravan of a rich Armenian merchant, and they succeeded in their enterprise. They assassinated the merchant and stole his goods. Unhappily for them, their crime was discovered. They were tried, flogged, and sent to hard labor in Siberia. The court admitted no extenuating circumstances, except in the case of Ali. He was condemned to the minimum punishment, 4 years imprisonment. His brothers loved him, with a father's rather than a brother's love. He was the only consolation of their exile. Dull and sad as a rule, they had always a smile for him. When they spoke to him, which they rarely did for they looked upon him as a child to whom it would be useless to speak seriously, their forbidding countenances lightened up. I always used to fancy they addressed him in a jocular tone, as they would an infant. When he replied, the brothers exchanged glances and smiled good-naturedly. His respect for them forbade him to speak to them first. How this young man preserved his tender heart, his native honesty, his frank cordiality without becoming perverted and corrupted during this period of hard labor is quite inexplicable. In spite of his gentleness, however, he had a strong stoical nature, as I later discovered. Chaste as a young girl, everything that was foul, cynical, shameful, or unjust filled his fine black eyes with indignation and made them finer than ever. Although no coward, he would allow himself to be insulted with impunity. He avoided quarrels and abuse and maintained his dignity. With whom, indeed, was he to quarrel? Everyone loved and cherished him. At first, he was only polite to me, but little by little, we got into the habit of talking together in the evening. In a few months, he had learnt to speak Russian perfectly, whereas his brothers never gained a correct knowledge of the language. He was intelligent, and at the same time modest and full of delicate feeling. Was an exceptional being, and I always think of my meeting him as one of the lucky events of my life. There are some natures so spontaneously good, and endowed by God with such great qualities, that the idea of their perversion seems absurd. One is never anxious about them. Accordingly, I never feared for Where is he now? One day, some considerable time after my arrival at the prison, I was stretched out on my camp bedstead, agitated by painful thoughts. Ali, though always industrious, was not working at that moment. It was not yet time for him to retire to bed. His brothers, who were celebrating some Mussulman festival, were also at rest. Ali lay with his head in his hands, in a state of reverie. Suddenly he said to me, "Well, you're very sad." I gazed at him in astonishment. Such a remark from Ali, who was always so delicate, so full of tact, seemed strange. But on looking closer, I saw so much grief, so much repressed suffering in his countenance, suffering caused no doubt by sudden memories, that I understood his anguish and told him so. He sighed deeply and smiled with a melancholy air. I always liked his charming smile. It showed 2 rows of teeth which the world's greatest beauty might have envied. I suppose you were thinking how this festival is celebrated in Dagestan. You were happy there. Yes, he replied with enthusiasm, and his eyes sparkled. How did you know I was thinking of such things? How could I fail to know? You were much better off than you are here. Why do you say that? What beautiful flowers there are in your country. Yes, it's a real paradise. Please say no more. He was much agitated. Listen, Ali. Have you a sister? Yes. Why do you ask? She must have been very beautiful if she is like you. Oh, there's no comparison between us. In all Dagestan, you'd never meet so beautiful a girl. My sister is indeed charming. I am sure that you've never seen anyone like her. My mother also is very handsome. And your mother was fond of you. Part I Chapter V, First Impressions continued. What do you mean? Of course she was. I'm sure she has died of grief. She was so fond of me. I was her favorite child. Yes, she loved me more than my sister, more than all the others. This very night she appeared to me in a dream and shed tears for me. He was silent, and never spoke again for the rest of the night. But from that moment, he sought my company and my conversation, although he remained most respectful and never ventured to address me first. On the other hand, he was happy when I spoke to him. He often talked of the Caucasus and of his past life. His brothers did not forbid him to converse with me. In fact, I think they even encouraged him to do so, and when they saw that I was fond of him, they became more affable towards me. Ali often helped me in my work. In barracks, He did everything he could to please me and save me trouble. In Bis' attentions, there was neither servility nor the hope of any advantage, but only a warm, cordial feeling which he did not try to hide. He had an extraordinary aptitude for the mechanical arts. He had learnt to sew very tolerably and to mend boots, and even understood something of carpentry, everything, in short, that could be learnt in prison. His brothers were proud of him. "Listen, Ali," I said to him one day, "why don't you learn to read and write Russian? It might be very useful to you here in Siberia. I should like to, but who would teach me? There are plenty of people here who can read and write. I'll teach you myself if you like." "Oh, do teach me, please," said Ali, raising himself up in bed. He joined his hands and looked at me with a suppliant air. We set to work the very next evening. I had a Russian translation of the New Testament, the only book that was not forbidden in prison. With that book alone, and without an alphabet, Ali learned to read in a few weeks, and after a few months he could do so perfectly. He brought an extraordinary zeal and warmth to his studies. One day, we were reading together the Sermon on the Mount. I noticed that he read certain passages with much feeling, and I asked him if he liked the gospel. He glanced up at me, and his face suddenly lighted up. Yes, Jesus is a holy prophet. He speaks the language of God. How beautiful it is, but tell me what it is that particularly pleases you. The passage which says, "Forgive those that hate you." Ah, how divinely he speaks. He turned towards his brothers, who were listening to our conversation, and said a few eager words. They talked together seriously for some time, approving what their young brother had said by a nodding of their heads. Then with a grave, kindly smile, quite a Mussulman's smile, I liked its gravity, they assured me that Jesus was a great prophet. He had done great miracles. He had created a bird with a little clay into which he breathed the breath of life, and the bird had flown away. That, they said, was written in their books. They were convinced that they would please me much by praising Jesus. As for Ali, he was happy to see that his brothers approved of our friendship, and that they were saying what he thought would gratify. My success in teaching Ali to write was quite extraordinary. He had obtained paper at his own expense, for he would not allow me to buy any, also pens and ink, and in less than 2 months he had learned to write. His brothers were astonished at such rapid progress. Their satisfaction and their pride were without bounds, and they were at a loss to express their gratitude. If we happened to be together in the workshop, they disputed as to which of them should help me. I am not, of course, speaking of Ali, who felt more affection for me than for his own brothers. I shall never forget the day of his release. He took me outside, threw himself on my neck and sobbed. He had never before embraced me, and never before wept in my presence. "You have done so much for me," he said. "Neither my father nor my mother have ever been kinder. You have made a man of me. God will bless you. I shall never forget you, never. Where is he now? Where is my good, kind, dear Ali?" Besides the Circassians, we had a certain number of Poles who formed a separate group. They had scarcely any relations with the other convicts. I have already said that, thanks to their hatred of the Russian prisoners, they were detested by everyone. All 6 of them were of a restless, morbid disposition. Some were men of education, of whom I shall have more to say later. It was from them that during the last days of my imprisonment I obtained a few books, and indeed the first work I read made a profound impression on me. I shall speak further on of that experience, which I look upon as very curious, though it will be difficult for the reader to understand. Of this I am certain, for there are certain things of which one cannot judge without having experienced them oneself. It will be enough for me to say that intellectual privation is more difficult to support than the most dreadful physical torture. A common man sent to hard labor finds himself in kindred society, perhaps even in more interesting society than he has been accustomed to. He loses his native place and family, but his ordinary surroundings are much the same as before. An educated man, condemned by law to the same punishment as the other, suffers incomparably more. He must stifle all his needs, all his habits. He must descend into a lower sphere, must breathe another air. He is like a fish thrown upon the sand. The punishment which he undergoes, equal in the eyes of the law for all criminals, is 10 times more severe and more painful for him than for the common man. This is an incontestable truth, even if one thinks only of material comforts that must be sacrificed. I was saying that the Poles formed a group by themselves. They lived together and took no notice of any of their fellow convicts, except a Jew, and that for no other reason than because he amused them. Our Jew was generally liked, although everyone laughed at him. We only had one, and even now I cannot think of him without a smile. Whenever I looked at him, I thought of the Jew Jankel in Gogol's Taras Balba, who, when undressed and ready to go to bed with his wife in a sort of cupboard, resembled a fowl. For Isaiah Fomitch Bumstein and a plucked fowl were as like one another as 2 drops of water. He was already about 50 years of age, small, feeble, cunning, and at the same time very stupid, bold, and boastful, though a horrible coward. His face was covered with wrinkles. His forehead and cheeks were scarred from the burning he had received in the pillory. I never understood how he had been able to live through the 60 strokes to which he had been condemned for murder. He carried on his person a medical prescription given him by other Jews immediately after his exposure in the pillory. They had promised that with the aid of that ointment, his scars would disappear in less than a fortnight. But he had been afraid to use it, and was waiting for the end of his 20 years penal servitude, when he would become a colonist and put the famous remedy to better use. "Otherwise I shall not be able to get married," he would say, "and it is essential that I marry." We were great friends, for his good humor was inexhaustible. Prison life did not seem to disagree with him. A goldsmith by trade, he received more orders than he could execute, for there was no jeweler's shop in the town. He thus escaped hard labor, and as a matter of course he lent money on pledges to the convicts, who paid him heavy interest. He had arrived at the prison before me, but one of the Poles described to me his triumphal entry. It is quite a history, and I shall relate it further on, for there is much to tell of Isaiah Fomitch Bumstein. As for the other prisoners, there were, first of all, 4 old believers, among whom were the old man from Starodub, 2 or 3 little Russians, very morose persons, and a young convict with delicate features and a finely chiseled nose. He was only about 23 years of age, but had already committed 8 murders. Then there was a band of coiners, one of whom was the buffoon of our barrack, and finally some somber, sour-tempered convicts, shorn and disfigured, always silent and full of envy. They looked askance at all who came near them, and must have been doing so for many years. I noticed all these people at a glance on the first night of my arrival. They were veiled in thick smoke. The atmosphere was poisonous and vibrant with obscene oaths, the rattling of chains, insults, and cynical laughter. I stretched myself out on the bare planks, my head resting on my coat, rolled up to do duty for a pillow, with which I had not yet been supplied. Then I covered myself with my sheepskin, but, owing to the painful impressions of the evening, I was unable for some time to get to sleep. My new life was only just beginning. The future held much that I had not foreseen, of which I had never had the least idea.